Hi there. Last time you saw me prepare the first part of this cover. And now we're gonna finish it. I mark the center of the swing point. I drill a piloting hole and check the alignment before I drill a full-sized hole and check that it aligns well. I sand down the surface in preparation for the next step. I will use the foam to fill the center of the cover, but I only need a 5 cm thick piece. So I cut the board in half and adjust it to fit with the cover base and align with the shape of the hull. I use a saw to get an approximate shape and the sander to fine-tune. I place the cover back on the hull so that I can draw the shape onto the cover. And after several iterations back and forth, I can move on to strengthen the swing hole by inserting a wood piece into the cover. Equipped with thickened epoxy, I can glue the wood piece in place. I also fill the oversized bolt hole with glass cutting and thickened epoxy. I need to adjust the foam to fit before I can glue it in place with a pre-wetting coat of thickened epoxy. Also on the foam, before I bring them together and secure it in place. After curing, I notice a big negative bend in the cover. This is a serious problem as it will limit the space for the board. I will need to change this, so I temporarily clamp a plank along the edge so it gives support to the saw blade. After removing the wood, I can glue it down again, but now with a slight positive bend. I need some thickened epoxy with cotton fibers and silica to fair out the unevenness in the surface. And I use gravity to my advantage as I seal the area around the fastening points and cover the sides with glass. I need to do this to make the sides waterproof. The fairing process is the most time-consuming, as I will need to repeat the sanding and the evaluation or checking several times. And thus I also carry on several side projects, like making the screw system for locking the cover and board, and seal that with glass. Before I prepare more fairing compound with the leftover from the epoxy batch. By using the leftovers as fairing, I decrease the epoxy waste. And by working on several parts in sequence, I can use the setup time of the sanding equipment for several purposes. Not only sanding the screw head, but also sanding the cover. I also do some sanding on the board I made in an earlier episode, in preparation for later painting. However, as I need to build more height on the cover, and epoxy is very expensive, I will cut some thin pieces of foam, glue those down on the low spots, and use the foam sawdust as filler in between. Mixed with thickened epoxy, it gets thick enough. And to further improve the contact with the board, I cover the edges with plastic and press it down with masking tape. It's not pretty, I know, but it works. After curing, I can remove the poor man's vacuum bagging, trim off the excess and sand down the surface to get down to the hull edge. If I hadn't been so careless when I first cut out the foam, I could have saved a lot of time with this fairing to the edge. At last I'm finished and can move inside again to check what more needs to be done. This is somewhat Sisyphus work, with sanding, checking, sanding and checking, until there is nothing more that needs to be removed. Now I can instead focus on what needs to be backfilled. I use plastic around the screw head to shape a circular hole. This is to integrate the screw head as much as possible into the cover. Then I smear thickened epoxy on the surface, make up some more epoxy and mix in some silica to further thicken it. To use as a filler where I have gaps, I level out the filler with the brush and lay down the 300 gram thick glass into the wet epoxy. Then I use regular epoxy to wet out the cloth from above. Later I add more filler on top of the glass to level out the small squares in the glass cloth. The day after I can extract the screw head from the cover. Add some more filler to some obvious low spots. And add glass to the sides to further build up the edge. Of course I will need to sand the surface to remove ridges. I cut a threaded rod to be glued into the screw head. Cover some small areas with glass, like here on the side, before I glue the rod into the screw head. Then I can use the leftovers from this epoxy batch as a filler in low spots, before the next step with the clean cutting and sanding. With a longboard and several more repetitions of filler and sanding, I'm ready for painting. I use the same 2-component epoxy paint here as I used for the hull in an earlier episode. I use the leftovers to paint the board as well. Now we will see how this fits. So the cover goes on like this. And then this will be screwed down. I think I'm quite happy, and we can move on from this.